Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us again on another one of our Safer at Home series. You've been listening to me waste Mr. Bordowich's time, so hope. And I just want to say, before we get started tonight, that it was not Mr. Bordowich's or my intention to have a program called Congress at War with a backdrop of what was going on in the nation's capital today. That was not a marketing ploy. It just weird timing. Before we get started tonight, our programs are sponsored, as you know, by Martha's Vineyard Savings and Cape Cod 5. All of our books, including this one, is available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope you participate in helping out a small business. If you got a question, use the chat feature on the bottom. And I will be in charge of Mr. Bordowich's slideshow. So if you've got any technical issues, it's my fault, not his. And our guest tonight is coming to us from San Francisco. He's the author of 8 nonfiction books, including the one we're going to talk about, Congress at War. If you want to know more about him, he's got a website for fergusbordowick.com. And without further ado, would you welcome our guest tonight, Fergus Bordowick?
Hi, everyone. Mark, thanks very much for inviting me to speak to people whom I can't see, but I know are out there. And well, I can see some of you anyway. And yeah, as I was saying to you just before we started, normally I talk about it, and I will talk about a time when Congress was embroiled in intense conflict. Although most of the conflict I'm talking about is within Congress. But the news today has been so extraordinary. I mean, normally I lived very comfortably in the mid-19th century, you know, and I have been riveted by today's news, as I'm guessing a lot of other people have as well. And I think maybe there you'll see some resonances in what I'm talking about here, because I am talking about an extremely contentious time within Congress during the Civil War. And Mark, let's go to the first couple of pictures, and I'll just, which are really for atmosphere. You can see here, my book is entitled Congress at War, as you said, Mark. My aim here was to show in a dramatic way the dynamic role that Congress played in, let's go to the first picture, if you don't mind, to Fort Sumter. Yeah, there we go. And to persuade you that the political story of how the Civil War was fought is as much of an epic as what took place on battlefields between opposing armies. And this book is not about politics in the abstract, but it's about it's as it was seen by the men and, where possible, women who lived it. No member of Congress arrived in Washington in 1861 anticipating 4 years of war. In fact, virtually no one anticipated war at all. Those who even accommodated themselves to the idea thought it would be a matter of a couple of weeks. Of the 2 wartime Congresses, that's the 37th and 38th, a radical Republican whom I talk about from time to time, his name was Albert Riddle. Riddle wrote, Mr. Lincoln, his cabinet, and the 37th Congress were elected to do anything, everything, except what fell to them to do, fight the greatest civil war in history. It came upon them as an utter surprise, which it did. The war, as we know, the shooting war begins in mid-April 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Several states have already seceded at that point. After the firing on Fort Sumter, the North reacts. Lincoln calls for troops to rush to the defense of Washington. Mark, let's go to the next image. in which we see, in fact, troops rushing to the defense of Washington. They are, in fact, these are Union troops performing maneuvers on a hillside with the US Capitol in the background. And it was touch and go there for a while, whether Washington could be protected at all. The entire United States Army in April of 1861 was about 16,000 men, 16,000 of whom about a quarter defected to the Confederacy, and most of the rest were at army posts scattered across the West. There were almost no troops to defend Washington. So whether the capital of the United States would fall to the Confederacy in the first days of conflict was anyone's guess for a while. Congress itself is meeting in the building you'll see next. And if you've been, let's go to the, yeah, great, thank you. And it's the very building you've been watching on television today, although you'll notice, obviously, that most of the dome is missing. It was under construction in 1861. And that incomplete dome was perceived as a symbol, a disturbing symbol of the incomplete, fractured Union. And in fact, the grounds of the Capitol were strewn with blocks of marble, as if to symbolize the fragments of the Union, with 11 states gone to the Confederacy. So everything I'm talking about today is taking place in this building, with construction of the Capitol taking place overhead, very noisily, by the way. Lincoln determined to carry completion of the Capitol dome on throughout the war, and it was completed in '63. So let's go to the next image. And this happens to be on the cover of my book. It's a great picture. It's one of the rare images, surprisingly rare, that shows Congress actually in session, and very, very actively so. You can see on the right side of the image, a congressman, I take it perhaps to be Thaddeus Stevens, who's in my book, orating. Two gentlemen in the middle are about to rush at each other, maybe take a punch at each other. And yes, this is one kind of Congress at war. And although my title really refers to Congress during the Civil War. So Congress in 1861 faced a multitude of existential challenges. They were gargantuan challenges. How could the North be mobilized for war of unimaginable magnitude? Was Congress or the president responsible for leading the war effort? Could the Republicans, who were completely untried, never having governed before, could they manage to govern? Could the war be fought, should it be fought, with respect to the sanctity of Southern property, that includes slaves, or with a ruthlessness that would bring the seceded states to their knees more quickly? Could the Constitution survive the suspension of civil rights in the name of national security? How would the war be paid for? Would its financial burden break the Northern economy? What should white Americans do about slavery? Could Republicans prevent the party from splitting between anti-slavery radicals and those who are willing to tolerate slavery as long as it was contained in the South? Bear in mind that the Democratic Party, the conservative to reactionary party of that time, had already split in two. You have to kind of invert today's alignment. The Republican Party of the Civil War era was the progressive party, the forward-looking kind of pro-federal government party of its time. Should African Americans be recruited to serve in the army? Would white soldiers refuse to fight with them, or alongside them, that is, after the war was won, assuming the North triumphed, which was anybody's guess until late 1864? Should the Southern states be broken up? Should ex-Confederates be prosecuted as war criminals? There was no consensus on any of these questions and on many others. Suspicion of central government in general was widespread. The idea of a strong executive was particularly distrusted, and embedded ideas of states' rights in the North as well as the South threatened to undermine the country's war-making ability. Throughout the war, racism, blunt, repeatedly articulated, savagely expressed racism threatened any attempt to emancipate slaves. Many Unionists, especially in the border states, regarded any kind of tampering with slavery as a threat to basic property rights. I'm going to quote a Unionist representative from Maryland who declared in 1862, I think, "If you take from us today our right to hold slaves, how long will it be before you will take from us some other constitutional right?" Crisfield was a Unionist, not a Republican. That's to say he was to the right of the Republican Party, but still a Unionist. With Southerners gone, the Republicans for the first time held decisive majorities in both houses of Congress, because by the spring of 1861, a third of the seats in both chambers were empty. They were abandoned by members who defected to the Confederacy. The Republicans began an era of legislative activism that would change American society pretty much beyond recognition. During the next 4 years, and I can only summarize it at the moment, Congress would help win the war, craft the peace, reinvent the nation's financial system, and enact a raft of forward-looking legislation that had been blocked for many years by Southern intransigence. And in the course of doing that, Congress laid the foundation for the strong activist central government that fully came into being in the 20th century. It also permanently altered the relationship between the states and the federal government and enshrined protection of civil rights as the responsibility of the federal government. These were radical achievements at the time. They were extraordinary, they were radical, and they were not even foreseen in 1861. The wartime Congresses were incredibly productive. I'm going to quote Senator John Sherman. That's the brother of General William Tecumseh Sherman. John Sherman was a young, rising, very effective member of the Senate. Sherman predicted that the many landmark laws Congress passed during the war will be a monument to good or evil. They cover such vast sums, delegate and regulate such vast powers, and are so far-reaching in their effects that generations will be affected, well or ill, by them. Congress raised hundreds of thousands of troops for the Union. It instituted the first military draft. It pushed hard against Lincoln for more aggressive generals, harsher strategy against the South, and the recruitment of African Americans. In providing financing for the war, Congress created the country's first national currency, the founder of the forerunner rather of the Internal Revenue Service, and the foundation for the Federal Reserve System. Congress also passed the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad Act, the Land Grant Colleges Act. None of these are typically thought of as war measures, but they were passed only because Republicans had the votes during the war. The South had stonewalled all those measures for, in some cases, decades. Long before Lincoln became willing to contemplate the emancipation of slaves, members of Congress demanded it, enacting laws that began the racial revolution that eventually overthrew the South's cotton economy and transformed 4 million, give or take 4 million, slaves from property into free men and women, culminating in the 13th Amendment. As Frederick Douglass said of the war years, the angel of liberty has one ear of the nation and the demon of slavery the other. Less happily, the widespread monitoring of anti-war dissidents and activists that was mandated by Congress created a precedent for the government's surveillance of private communications and allegedly unpatriotic political activity that's become, in the 20th century, a controversial, deservedly controversial feature of our present day political life. Editors were jailed, even elected officials sometimes were stopped from speaking. Individuals were arrested for exercising what were indeed their First Amendment rights. That was not universal. It happened in some places, but it did happen. So anyway, in this book, I try to treat congressional politics as a dynamic art that's full of maneuver and endlessly seeking, groping for compromise and the transmuting of hopes and ideals into policy, which is what American politics always is. I generally try to keep this story within the historical present. That is, moving through the war as the members of Congress and other Americans moved through it without knowing what the end game was until it came to be. I want you, the reader, to feel the anxiety and the uncertainty and sometimes often fear and despair, as well as the patriotic fervor and sometimes irrational confidence that characterized almost every stage of the war. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip a couple of things I often like to digress into. I'll just tease you a tad here by saying that, you know, I write a great deal about who was in Congress, who made up Congress, what kinds of people generally, before I talk about a few of the specific individuals who loom large. And by and large, you have the same proportions of brilliant, mediocre, and utterly incompetent people as you do today, I think. Most were professional politicians and lawyers. By far, they were opinionated and often brilliantly eloquent and very combative. They enjoyed none of the resources that Congress has today. That's to say, they had no staff, no private offices, no research facilities, apart from the Library of Congress, which was a room on the second floor. And despite this quite grandiose interior decor, this picture doesn't really communicate it adequately, but the atmosphere inside was extremely democratic and informal, very rough in its manners, and typically perfumed with the possibly asphyxiating aroma of cigars, whiskey, and in the summer, particularly a lot of sweaty male bodies. There were bathtubs in the basement of Congress for members to take baths because they couldn't necessarily count on bathing in the rooming houses where most of them lived. Strangers wandered in and out of the chambers and sprawled at members' unoccupied desks. Strangely enough, if you were watching TV today, you saw that happening. You saw that happening with the invaders, the protesters, the mob, who for some time took over, particularly the House and the Senate floor today. But in the 19th century, it was not uncommon uncommon to see ordinary citizens just sprawling in congressmen's chairs, because citizens regarded it as their property. I'm going to just quote one guy who this is a tourist who's from the state of Maine, who came during the war. And this reflects the typical attitude of ordinary citizens to Congress. Finding the coast clear, I gambled up and down from gallery to gallery, sat in Sumner's chair, examined Wilson's books, and pocketed a castaway autograph or two. So all this is going on along with lobbyists who literally stood in the lobby of the building, which is why they're called lobbyists, plucking at the coats and the sleeves of members of Congress, begging for annuities or for contracts, for anything under the sun. And in addition, you can see in the upper right of this image the galleries, which are packed with people. Congress was the best show, not just in town, but in America. People came and they packed the galleries day after day after day to hear these orators speak, often for hours and hours with no notes. It was a far cry from today's kind of soundbite-oriented, non-oratory in Congress. Anyway, let's move on. I've built the story around four men. Mark, let's go to the next image here so you can see. Thaddeus Stevens, brilliant man, one of the most significant, though far too little known members of Congress in American history. Stevens was an outspoken radical, possibly the most radical man in Congress, as well as a brilliant parliamentarian. He was the dominant member of the House through much of the war, even though his politics were radical, even by the standards of his own party, because he was so skillful on the floor. He was Vermont born, but made his career in Pennsylvania. He was certainly the fiercest abolitionists in the House, and a driving force, and the most practical driving force behind anti-slavery legislation. In contrast, I'll say just parenthetically, since I'm speaking to people in Massachusetts, in contrast to Charles Sumner, the very famous senator from Massachusetts, who was a great orator, extremely popular in the anti-slavery movement, but very ineffectual in Congress. He didn't know how to do politics. He did moralism rather than politics. Stevens did both. Let's go to the next image. Thank you, Mark. This gentleman is Senator Benjamin F. Wade of Ohio. In the Senate, one of the most outspoken Republicans and radical Republicans, and a driving force in the Senate for a hard war against the Confederacy. He chaired the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which is a mouthful, but that committee oversaw the war effort. It rode herd on not just military expenditures, but on the armies, on the generals, and it hammered away at Lincoln to appoint more effective generals and frankly also more political radicals as generals. Those radicals, regrettably, were not necessarily very effective generals, but the net effect was to force the administration to fight the war harder, which was essential to win, in my view. The third image we have here in this wonderful profile is William Pitt Fessenden of Maine, who also ought to be well known, but isn't any longer. He was a conservative man by nature, but he aligned himself with the radicals during the war. And more than any other single individual in Congress, he was responsible for the legislation that enabled the North to pay for the war. I write a great deal in this book about how the war was paid for. Strangely enough, hardly anybody writes about that. And if you think about it, wars, you don't get to fight a war for free. And the Treasury was in deficit at the beginning of the war. It's a long story to that. Money, prodigious amounts of money had to be raised and raised again and again and again and again as the war went on longer and longer and longer. And it was a brilliant feat of politics. Fessenden worked very closely with Thaddeus Stevens, who was responsible for money bills in the House. The two of them together in tandem made it possible to fight, finish, and win the war. The fourth person in my gallery here, these are the four people who loom largest in my book. This guy's, so to speak, a ringer. He is not a radical Republican. He's not a Republican. This is Clement Laird Vallandigham, who was the leading Copperhead, that's to say anti-war Democrat in Congress. And I use him really as a window, as an entry point into the thinking of Democrats, particularly anti-war Democrats, who did a great deal to try to obstruct the war and would readily have quit the war at any point up to 1864, when the Democrats were decisively defeated by Lincoln. He was a very picturesque character. He's not likable. He was an extreme Negrophobe. That's to say, frightened of Black people and racist, extremely open about it, as so many Democrats were. Nonetheless, he had a great classical education. He was immensely well read. He saw himself as a moral man. And his view of the Union was basically a Southern one, except he was from the state of Ohio. And his views and his actions came very close to treason, at least in the view of Republicans. I'd say he went over the line. He was expelled to the Confederacy in 1863, as a matter of fact. The Confederacy didn't want him there. Why? Even though he'd been defending, or rather opposing the war all along. To the Confederacy, he was of no use in the South. He was of great use to them in the North. So to make a long and interesting story very short, they basically sent him out of the Confederacy to Bermuda, got him on a British ship to Canada, traveled through Canada and perched in Ontario for most of the rest of the war as a liaison to anti-war Democrats. Anyway, let's go down the next image. Just to say what this is a cartoon of Copperheads, anti-war Democrats. Anyone seeing this in 1862 or 3 would think of one of those heads on the snakes as Vallandigham, who you just saw. Let's go to the next image. Now, the person you haven't heard me talk about is this guy, Abraham Lincoln. Why no Lincoln? What happened to Lincoln? Okay. And by the way, I've chose this picture in particular because it is so intense. And this is Lincoln just on the cusp of the war. No beard. He grew it at the beginning of the war. And this is Lincoln before he becomes Father Abraham. Lincoln was politically a work in progress. He became, I mean, his character, we all know, it was extraordinary, and I, like most people, would probably, I would put him as the best president we've ever had. But it took some learning for him to get there. He didn't start out that way. It was a learn on the job. He was a learn on the job president. But at any rate, why am I not writing about him very much? Of course, he's in this book. One, he's not a member of Congress. This is a book about Congress during the war. There are innumerable great books about Lincoln during the war, to the strange exclusion of Congress. Lincoln did not run the federal war effort by himself, although many writers and even historians have been accustomed to seeing it that way. And that tends to reflect a 20th century view of the presidency. That's to say, as the central engine of power in the federal government. It was not seen that way in the 19th century, that locus of power resided in Congress. So Congress and Lincoln, as so often in American history, were often at odds, sometimes collaborated. Congress was the radicals in Congress were often far in advance of Lincoln. Some would say they led Lincoln. Lincolnists say Lincoln was just wisely biding his time until he was ready. Both things to some extent are true. They wrestled more than anything else over war powers, which in the 21st century, not to mention at other times, is still a hot bone of contention. Who really has the power to wage war? Is it the president or is it Congress? So these are that issue, that debate, like many others in this book, which I touched on rather quickly, are still live ones. So I think I should try to bring this to a conclusion here. And I mean, inescapably, I'm asked, and you know, I ask myself, what does this have to say about today's Congress or today's politics? Does it have anything to say? And the answer is both yes and no. I think, and I've written about this in other books as well, the truth is often distorted by our desire to enlist the past on behalf of our present concerns, by changing moral values and the difficulty of figuring out what our ancestors really meant, even when we hear their literal words. With respect to another book, I wrote a book called The First Congress, and which is about the origin of the federal government. And I like to say, when I'm talking about that, there were no originalists at the origin. Nobody at the beginning thought that what they were doing would be unchangeable for all time. That's a recent phenomenon that reflects contemporary politics and very much not what the founders thought or intended. But anyway, this is a different book. But I do think that the story of Congress during the Civil War certainly has a lot actually, to teach us about how government can function at its best in challenging times, and how crisis may even make it stronger. I am not negative about government. I think we have a great government. We have a great machine that function. I mean, it looks like a Rube Goldberg operation sometimes, if those of you who are my age know what I'm talking about. But anyway, to put it differently, a lot of Americans think the government functions terribly. They're disappointed by it, deeply so, and obviously the mob storming the Capitol today certainly reflected that kind of contempt for our institutions. You know, this book is tacitly, not polemically, a brief for Congress and for representative government, despite its frustrations and disappointments. I didn't intend that to be true when I started this book a few years ago, but in this rather strange and increasingly disturbing moment that we've been living in, the appeal of the authoritarian style has taken on new life, not just here, but also elsewhere. And contempt for Congress has dangerously grown. According to some polls, less than 10% of Americans profess confidence in Congress, and almost 1/3 of young Americans say they don't think it's important to live in a democracy. These are shocking numbers. So disdain for Congress flourishes alongside the belief that the presidency was always the main engine of government, as I said a few minutes ago, rather than an office whose power is deliberately, carefully, and thoroughly circumscribed by the Constitution. During the Civil War, Democrats in Congress repeatedly attacked Abraham Lincoln as a tyrant, and even fellow Republicans, even those, the radicals whom I am fond of, questioned his competence and investigated his generals. But as beleaguered as he felt, Lincoln never claimed that Congress lacked the authority to challenge his actions or declined ever to answer legislators' requests for information. He recognized Congress as the primary repository of the people's will, and he understood that the founders never intended the president to be beyond the reach of its authority. So, you know, as I implied a few minutes ago, Congress may seem needlessly quarrelsome and inefficient, but its workings really are just the cacophony of the whole multitude, great, vast, and increasingly large multitude of American voices distilled to 535 representatives and senators. Senator Fessenden, chairman of the Finance Committee, one of the heroes in my book, in particular, understood that Congress was I'm paraphrasing him, and then I'm going to quote him. He understood that Congress was a stew of self-interests seasoned with passions, and that to accomplish anything required creative skill, tolerance, and immense patience. Republican politics, that's the politics of the republic, is always messy from the beginning. The founders knew it. They fought a revolution not to tame politics. I don't know why Americans want tame politics. Not to tame politics, but to put politics with all its often frustrating turbulence into government. As Fessenden put it, I would not have perfect quiet always. In a republic, especially, you never find quiet except under a tyranny. I'm going to end with that. I like that quote, and you know, I have no objection to this. By the way, let's leave with this. This is an upbeat image. This is the passage of the 13th Amendment. It was one of the most intense moments ever in Congress. You've all seen Lincoln, I'm sure, and it pretty well represents what happened and what it looked like. Men who never thought that they would vote for a bill that enhanced the citizenship of Black people were voted for this, and they were on the floor weeping in each other's arms because they knew that they had done the right thing. One wishes today that there were perhaps more members of Congress who understood that the sanctity of the Constitution, the safety of the Republic, and the right thing involve more than their own opportunistic self-advancement. But we have what we have, and we will continue to as our ancestors have, to wade through this and move forward. So I understand that we have time for some questions. Am I right, Mark?
You are right. And yes, if we, as I said at the top, if you've got a question, put it in the chat feature. Question for you, as I'm listening to this, and this has kind of been, this is sort of an ongoing question. As I listen to the term radical Republicans, and you know that's you know, we all read our textbooks. That's the phrase we all grew up with. Is that an apt description? I mean, were they progressive? Were they? I mean, radical sounds so wild-eyed, and you know that they stormed the castle. Is that a fair assessment of that branch of the Republican Party?
Yeah, great question. Well, that is how they defined themselves. And that is how they were defined within the Republican Party, as opposed to moderates, a term that was in use then. And as they continued to be defined after the Civil War through Reconstruction. The word radical has acquired a lot of accretion of meaning since the Civil War era. And yes, I think it's colored by a kind of cartoonish image we may have of wild-eyed early 20th century anarchists with smoking bombs in their hands and so on and so on, which is an image fostered by the by conservative Americans of the early 20th century. That was not part of the political lingo of the 19th century. it described particularly those who wanted the greatest change. Simply that, no more, no less. But more particularly, it defined those who were absolutely committed to emancipation and increasingly to social equality, the social equality of Black people. Not minimal, not just the end of slavery, but maximal citizenship, 13th, 14th, and finally 15th Amendments. The driving engine for that politics were men who were radical for their time. They tried not to acquiesce to anything less than complete victory in the war, but you didn't have to be a radical to be for complete victory in the war, but a transformation of American society, which involved destruction of the cotton economy, the plantation economy, ideally a reorganization of the South in new states with population, with an admixture of immigrants from the North and abroad who would change the complexion of society in the South and break down the aristocratic or caste society of the South, coupled to maximal citizenship for Blacks. Pretty radical.
You mentioned that, when you focus on that slide of Lincoln, obviously the Republican Party was still fairly new. It had only been around for 5-6 years at that point, but when they actually get elected to presidency, how did Lincoln view this wing of the party, and how did they view him? I mean, even though they're both Republicans, seemed to be a lot of tug and pull there on both ends.
When you say this wing of the party, you're referring again to the radicals.
The radicals, right? Yes.
Okay. He viewed them in every way possible on the spectrum, which is to say, I think in his sentiments, he was often very close to them. Not always. I mean, Lincoln was never a radical. He shunned the word radical. Lincoln was absolutely a moderate Republican when he came into office. Increasingly, as it became clear that the South would have to be crushed on the battlefield if the war was to be won, and two, that it was imperative to end slavery, he moved in the direction of radical positions. The same thing happened with William Pitt Fessenden, who was a comparative, let's call him a moderate, he referred to himself as a conservative, but also embraced pretty much the gamut of radical policies by the end of the war. Lincoln was often irritated at radicals who wanted him to move faster. That's true. That's a consensus view among historians, and I think I agree with it. He was irritated by them. I think sometimes Lincoln did move too slowly. It took him a very long time to accept that the war would really be a war to the end. That the South, he had a delusional idea, which was common. It's not unique to Lincoln, but a delusional idea that there was a great mass of Unionists in the South who were just waiting to become Republicans. That didn't exist. They didn't exist. There were some, but not what Lincoln imagined. So Lincoln, too often, I think, was wished to be as soft-handed as he could. Whereas the radicals from the start knew that constituency didn't exist in the South, they pushed him hard. But there was constant tugging over this. And there was tugging over the question of the suspension of habeas corpus, which Lincoln took upon himself to suspend early in the war when Congress was not in session. I mean, what that suspension meant was basically that the military could arrest people who were felt to be potential collaborators with the Confederates, who existed, who were very significant, in some states, the border states particularly, especially Maryland. And even Republicans were not very comfortable with that because they believed that only Congress had the right to suspend habeas corpus. And they finally finessed it more than a year into the war. So there's a tug of war, but a growing unity of mind.
You mentioned Van Landingham. How many Copperheads were there? I mean, what was the how many Democrats were in Congress at this point, and how many of those Democrats made up the Copperheads?
In Congress, the Democrats are a beleaguered minority throughout the war because so many Democrats had gone south. They were from the South. Northern Democrats split into war Democrats, who essentially cooperated with the Republicans, voted for all war measures. Quite a few of them became military officers. And ultimately, a fair number of them became Republicans. So the rump, the Democratic rump of anti-war people, not all were Copperheads. You were talking about a few dozen in the House, and we're talking about a relative handful in the Senate. Some are from the border states, but certain northern states have very intense Copperhead anti-war movements, especially in the Midwest, the lower Midwest. That's Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and there are pockets almost everywhere outside New England. And Indiana was so infested with Copperhead sentiment and elected essentially a Copperhead legislature in 1862 that the governor, a Republican, Governor Morton, basically did not call the Indiana legislature into session and governed single-handedly for the rest of the war. Yes, he was challenged as ruling as an authoritarian. On the other hand, that legislature might well have taken Indiana out of the war. There were also there were mobbing and assassinations of recruiters in the North in these several states. There were bands of renegade deserters, Union desert Copperheads who had been drafted, who were in the army but deserted and hid out in their states and were protected by parts of the Democratic Party. And there was definitely in 1864, 63, 64, some collaboration of Democratic Party office holders in some states with the Confederacy. So it was significant. Their numbers in Congress were not significant, except that they existed as a megaphone for the views of Copperheads. But nationally, the North was fairly divided.
You seem to have, of the characters that you mentioned of the four, seem to have an affinity for Fessenden. What drew you to him, and why isn't he better known? And because you're right, somebody had to pay for this, and that seems to be kind of a neglected part of Civil War history. Yeah. We never seem to focus on the finances.
Well, a couple of reasons that are a bit varied. In a personal way, he's a very interesting man. He was a wonderful writer of letters. So his letters are excellent. They're all available at Bowdoin College in Maine. In fact, I think they may even be online now. I'm not positive about that. So it's easier to get inside him than it is some others. See, what was he really preoccupied with in a personal way? Physically, he suffered a great deal from illnesses, really a great deal. But he was made of Yankee granite. And I confess a fondness for granite Yankees. I'm from the Northeast myself. I'm not a Californian. I spent a fair bit of my earlier life in Vermont and so on. So I got a fondness. So I like his character. He was a man of great character. Let me simplify it and just say character. He was a rock. He was an absolute rock. He did what had to be done staunchly. He worked 26 hours a day. Okay. Two, because his political evolution is interesting. Because he started out as a self-described conservative, though a Republican, and evolved into, in effect, a radical. That journey is interesting because in him you see somebody coming to recognize how that it was absolutely imperative for the country's survival that the war be won and that the Confederacy be completely defeated, that there be no compromise solution. Three, I will say, because I found the financial side of the war fresh ground. It was interesting for me to write about. I mean, it's because it's been so little treated by others. So I felt I was learning a lot myself every step of the way as I worked through with them, with the men of the time, each cycle of struggling desperately to find money, and the desperation of Northerners in government, I think actually comes across best in the struggle to raise money. It's not a sexy subject, although I think I've treated it in a way that teases out the dramatic dimension of it in the book. With each cycle, there's a cycle of despair and relief, despair, desperation, relief, several times over in the war. And it's really there. That's out of the sight. The public kind of knows this is happening, but when we think about or write about the Civil War, I mean, first come the battles, or first comes Lincoln, then become battle, then we have battles, and the money element has been grossly neglected. But it's deeply interesting, actually. It also money is what makes the wheels go around in America. You know.
Mm-hmm. How long did you work on this book? What originally drew you to this topic, and what's next?
Okay, I began thinking about this book a few years before I began it. Way back, 7 or 8 years ago, I was invited to give a presentation at the U.S. Capitol by the U.S. Capitol Historical Society on the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. That was the Senate House Committee led by Ben Wade that oversaw the war effort. And Wade, one, is a fabulous personality. I haven't talked much about him, but he's a wonderful, two-fisted, rip-roaring kind of Western figure. Western is anything west of the Appalachians in those days, by the way. So that was probably about 8 years ago now. And when I delved into the records of the Committee on the Conduct of the War, there was a magnificent repository of material here which has hardly ever been used. That took me as a researcher right into men thinking about the waging of the war while it was taking place. So that was the genesis of the idea. The actual I began doing some research a little bit after that, but the writing of the book was 2 years, which is about my average. There was a third part to the question. Just remind me.
I didn't know what was next.
Oh yes, what's next? Yes, I'm well along with my next book, which is about the federal war against the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s. Again, a story which is inadequately understood. There's a great deal to be written, and it involves a few of the same people as this book, and it folded out of the one that we're talking about here today.
Okay. Got an interesting question here. Do you think congressmen of that era were more dedicated to their jobs and less concerned with re-election and special interests?
Simple question. No. No. I firmly say that. I'll say why, briefly. And I should say parenthetically that my wife and I, lived in Washington during most of the Obama years. My wife had a very interesting, fairly high position in the U.S. Senate, not a senator, different kind of job. So we were very, very close in, and we've been involved in politics, mainly in New York State, where we're from, on and off for years. And I've talked to many members of government, and I speak of people from the other party as well, by and large. There are some exceptions, but you'd probably be able to guess which party I belong to by this point, but if you can't, it doesn't matter. That I'm impressed by the commitment and both to institutions and to hard work and representing constituents of people pretty much across the board. I said during my talk about the Civil War Congress, there was about the average, the usual proportions of brilliant, capable, and totally incompetent. And I tend to think that was true amongst the founders too, by the way. The first Congress, the founding Congress, about the same. And the usual number of drunks and usual number of gas bags. So, you know, I think, and I truly believe that trying times bring out the best. Look, we're in an era today of intense political conflict. It's not the first time in American history. We've been through numerous periods like this, and every age thinks it's the worst. Every era thinks it's the worst. And I think it is unwise, short-sighted, and ahistorical to underrate the caliber of the people who go into Congress. Special interests change. They change. They've changed. They're not the same. There've always been special interests, and it's just part of the landscape of politics in America.
And maybe that's a segue into this last question. If Congress of the Civil War era were allowed to travel today, what would they think of today's current events?
Well, I think the Unionists, and particularly the Republicans among them, would think about what's going on today just about the way they thought about secessionists in 1861. And the language would be just about identical, I think. They would be enraged, shocked, horrified. And as far as presidents go, well, you know, you should read what they said about Buchanan, and who was, along with Andrew Johnson, always in contention, always amongst historians, for who's the worst president. I mean, personally, I think it's self-evident that's not the competition anymore. But and I think the war made many, including Lincoln, it made many people great. Trying times help produce greatness, I think. And I grant you, we see plenty of people today who are far, far, far from that. Far from that. I could find fault with some people in my own party as well, but that's not what this conversation's about. And you know, I feel, along with Fessenden, my friend Fessenden, and with the others I've been talking about, don't give up on the government, don't give up on Congress, don't give up on the people who go into politics. I mean, it's, in my view, a heroic endeavor. heroic and often pretty thankless, frankly. You know, the founders knew what they were about, and the refounders, those who refounded the government during the Civil War years and after, knew what they were about. And they had, all of them, a vision of a better America. And there are plenty of people in Congress today who have that vision as well. And we shouldn't give up hope.
All right. Well, that's a good place to end. That's a good. I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you for taking the time. If you want to learn more about our speaker tonight, it's fergusbordewick.com. The name of the book is Congress at War. Thank you very much for joining us. Hope things are okay out in San Francisco. So thank you everybody for joining us. Stay safe, everyone, and good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone on your end. It was a great pleasure.
All right. Thank you, everybody.